September 29th, 2000, Beech Grove, Indiana. A quiet evening in a tight-knit community just outside Indianapolis. Routine police patrol suddenly turned into chaos. Within minutes, an officer, William Bill Toney, was down, mortally wounded. The shooter? 23-year-old Benjamin Donnie Ritchie, a troubled young man on the run. But what really happened that night? Was this a calculated, cold-blooded murder? Or the desperate act of someone spiraling out of control? This case would leave a community shaken and take nearly 25 years to fully unravel. You're watching All True Crime Network, where we uncover the darkest and most gripping real-life cases. If you love deep dives into true crime stories, hit that subscribe button now and join our growing community. Before the headlines, before the tragedy, there was Officer William Bill Toney. Just 31 years old, Bill was more than a uniform. He was a husband, a father, and a man known for his kindness. He was the kind of officer colleagues respected, the kind of neighbor communities trusted. Friends described him as selfless, always stepping up, always volunteering to cover shifts. On the night he was killed, he wasn't even supposed to be on duty. He was filling in for another officer, a simple act of generosity that would cost him everything. Tributes poured in from fellow officers and the community alike, painting a picture of a man deeply dedicated to both his family and his city. On the other side of this tragedy was Benjamin Donnie Ritchie. Born in 1977 and raised in Indiana, Ritchie's life was marked by instability from the start. Reports suggest he was exposed to alcohol before birth and lead during childhood, factors that doctors later linked to behavioral and mental health struggles. As he grew, his path veered toward crime, petty thefts, reckless stunts, and constant run-ins with police. By the fall of 2000, Ritchie was already wanted in connection with a stolen van. Neighbors described him as volatile, charming one moment, explosive the next. A young man spiraling, crashing headlong toward tragedy. And on that September night, his path collided fatally with Officer Bill Toney's. September 29th, 2000. Officer William Bill Toney was doing what he always did, serving his community. That night, he responded to a report of a stolen van. It seemed routine at first, but nothing about what followed would be routine. Spotting the suspect, 23-year-old Benjamin Donnie Ritchie, Officer Toney gave chase. Through the quiet streets of a Beech Grove neighborhood, the two raced, one running toward escape, the other running toward duty. Neighbors peeked from windows, hearing the pounding footsteps and shouts in the dark. Then, gunfire. In the struggle, Ritchie pulled a weapon. Shots rang out, echoing across the block. Officer Toney was struck multiple times. He fell where he stood, mortally wounded. Within minutes, the man who was a husband, a father, and a respected officer was gone. The neighborhood erupted in chaos. Witnesses described the scene as unreal, disbelief turning to grief as word spread that a beloved officer had been cut down in the line of duty. And yet, one haunting question lingered. Investigators had a suspect, but how would they prove, beyond all doubt, that Benjamin Donnie Ritchie had pulled the trigger? The investigation into Officer William Bill Toney's murder moved fast, shockingly fast. Police wasted no time narrowing in on a suspect. All trails pointed to one man, Michael Ritchie. Almost immediately, investigators found themselves piecing together fragments of a chase that had gone fatally wrong. Ballistic experts examined the recovered weapon, and the results were damning. The gun matched the bullets that had struck Officer Toney. The science was clear, this was no coincidence. But it wasn't just cold, hard evidence that sealed the focus on Ritchie. Eyewitness accounts poured in from the quiet neighborhood where the pursuit had unfolded. Residents described the chaos. Seeing a man sprinting away from the stolen van, uniformed officer in pursuit, and then the unthinkable sound of gunfire echoing through the streets. Their descriptions matched Ritchie down to the smallest detail. Within mere hours of the crime, the manhunt came to an end. Michael Ritchie was arrested. For investigators, the swiftness of that arrest brought some relief, but for the community, the heartbreak remained. A respected officer was gone, taken in the line of duty. When prosecutors stepped in, their stance was fierce and uncompromising. They painted Ritchie as cold-blooded, a man who had no hesitation pulling the trigger on a uniformed officer, no hesitation in robbing a family, a department, and a town of one of its protectors. To them, this wasn't just murder. It was an attack on the very badge itself. But the defense team had another strategy in mind. They began to hint, ever so carefully, at something deeper. They suggested Ritchie's state of mind wasn't stable. They whispered of mental illness, of impaired judgment. Was this truly a calculated execution? Or was it the desperate, broken act of a man spiraling out of control? The courtroom drama was already being staged long before the trial began. Prosecutors stood firm on justice for a fallen officer. The defense quietly built a case that might shift the narrative away from cold-blooded intent and toward the mind of the accused. And that tension, that push and pull between guilt and mental state, was about to become the heart of this case. If you're still with us, you're clearly fascinated by this case. Make sure to hit subscribe to All True Crime Network so you don't miss our next story. By 2002, nearly 2 years after Officer William "Bill" Toney's tragic death, the eyes of Indiana turned to a Marion County courtroom. This was not just another criminal trial. It was a battle for justice, a fight to determine the fate of the man accused of gunning down a police officer in the line of duty. The prosecution came out strong. From day one, their message was unmistakable. Michael Ritchie knew exactly what he was doing. They painted him as a man fully aware of his actions, a man who deliberately pulled the trigger on a uniformed officer who was simply carrying out his lawful duty. To them, this was not a crime of impulse, not a moment of confusion. This was a calculated murder, an act of defiance against law and order itself. And for that, they declared, the only just punishment was death. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. Every word from the state's attorneys rang with intensity as they reminded jurors of the evidence, the ballistics, the eyewitnesses, the chase through the neighborhood, and the officer who never made it home that night. Their case was clear, sharp, and unrelenting, but the defense was not without a strategy. Their approach struck at a different chord, one meant to stir empathy, or at least doubt. They argued that Michael Ritchie was not the calculating killer the prosecution portrayed. Instead, they spoke of brain damage, of long-standing struggles with mental illness, of a man whose thinking was clouded and impaired. Could the jury really say, beyond all doubt, that he had the full capacity to make rational choices that night? It became a clash of perspectives, cold, methodical intent versus fractured, damaged judgment. As witnesses were called, experts cross-examined, and exhibits laid bare before the jury, the courtroom became a stage for high drama. Families sat in the gallery, hearts heavy, waiting for the outcome that would define their lives forever. When closing arguments came, the air felt thick with finality. The prosecution, unwavering, demanded accountability, reminding the jurors of the uniform, the badge, and the sacrifice of Officer Toney. The defense, in contrast, urged them to look deeper, to consider mercy in light of Ritchie's mental state. And then, it was up to the jury. Hours stretched into tense waiting. Deliberations were careful, methodical, but ultimately the verdict came down with unmistakable force. Guilty. Michael Ritchie was convicted of the murder of Officer William Toney. But the trial wasn't over. The next chapter was even more harrowing. Sentencing. The jury weighed the ultimate punishment, knowing their recommendation would forever shape the legacy of this case. After hearing every argument, after considering every fact, they returned with their decision. They recommended the death penalty. In October 2002, the judge made it official. Michael Ritchie was formally sentenced to death. The courtroom, filled with grief and relief, absorbed the weight of that moment. Justice, some felt, had been served. For others, the pain remained, knowing no verdict could ever bring back Officer Toney. This trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a story of loss, accountability, and the sharp divide between law and mercy. And it left a permanent mark on Marion County's history. With the verdict delivered and the death sentence imposed, Michael, later known as Benjamin, Ritchie was transferred to Indiana State Prison. There, behind the walls of the state's most secure facility, he would spend the next 2 decades on death row. But the story didn't end with the gavel strike in 2002. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a long, grueling legal battle. Ritchie's attorneys launched appeal after appeal, determined to save his life. They argued that his trial counsel had been ineffective, that key evidence about his mental health had been overlooked, and that he was intellectually disabled, unfit under the law for execution. Disability rights advocates soon rallied behind the case. To them, it wasn't simply about one man's guilt. It was about fairness and justice in America's death penalty system. They pointed to evidence of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, to signs of permanent brain damage, to a history of impairment that raised troubling questions about responsibility and intent. In their eyes, executing Ritchie would not be justice. It would be a failure of justice. Yet time and again, the courts disagreed. Appeals were reviewed, arguments weighed, and rulings upheld. The death sentence remained intact. Each legal challenge ended in the same conclusion. The conviction and punishment would stand. And so, the calendar turned forward. Days became months, months became years, and years became decades. Until finally, May 20th, 2025. The date that had hung like a shadow over Benjamin Ritchie's life arrived. That evening, in the death chamber at Indiana State Prison, the sentence was carried out by lethal injection.
25 years ago has been executed. Benjamin Ritchie died by lethal injection overnight at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. Ritchie was executed around 1:46 this morning Eastern Standard Time, just hours after the Supreme Court denied a request for an emergency stay. Ritchie was sentenced to death for the murder of Beech Grove police officer William Toney. He was put to death by lethal injection with a drug pentobarbital. The AP News reporting that 5 people were allowed to witness Ritchie's execution. Media witnesses, though, were not allowed in. You might remember last week, Governor Mike Brunn denied Ritchie clemency following the parole board's recommendations.
Before the drugs flowed, Ritchie was given the chance to speak his final words. He looked out and said softly, "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." His last meal, fittingly chosen, was the tour of Italy from Olive Garden, a trio of classic comfort foods: lasagna, fettuccine alfredo, and chicken parmesan. At 7:57 p.m., Benjamin Ritchie was pronounced dead. For the family of Officer William "Bill" Toney, that moment brought a measure of closure. After nearly 25 years of waiting, the man convicted of killing their husband, father, and son had finally faced the ultimate consequence. For them, justice had been served. But outside the prison walls, the debate continued. To some, the execution was the rightful conclusion to a brutal crime against a man in uniform. To others, it stirred deep unease. Was it true justice to put to death a man with documented brain damage and impaired thinking? Was accountability served, or had the system failed to show mercy where mercy was due? The case of Benjamin Ritchie leaves behind no easy answers. What it does leave is a story of tragedy on all sides. A fallen officer whose life was stolen, a community left shaken, and a man whose own troubled mind became both the weapon of destruction and the centerpiece of his defense. And in that tension, between justice and mercy, between punishment and forgiveness, lies the enduring legacy of this haunting case. The death of Officer William "Bill" Toney is more than just a line in a case file. It's a sobering reminder of the dangers police officers face every single day. One call, one chase, one heartbeat can mean the difference between life and death. His sacrifice stands as a testament to the thin and fragile line between order and chaos, law and lawlessness. And yet, the story of Benjamin Ritchie's execution complicates that sense of closure. For many, the final act was justice fulfilled, a community standing firm that violence against an officer in uniform will never go unanswered. But for others, it stirred questions that echo far beyond Marion County, Indiana. Should America execute men and women who are mentally impaired, who carry the scars of brain damage and disorders they never chose? Can a legal system, built and run by human hands, ever deliver justice that is truly perfect? Or is justice always clouded by flaws, by bias, by the frailty of human judgment itself? In the end, this case leaves us with 2 truths standing side by side. 1, an officer was killed in the line of duty, and his family, after decades of waiting, finally saw accountability. And 2, a man damaged and impaired was put to death by the state, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions. That tension between justice and mercy, closure and doubt, is what makes this case unforgettable. It forces us not only to remember the tragedy of September 29, 2000, but to wrestle with the moral weight of how we choose to punish. You've been watching All True Crime Network. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you gripping true crime cases every week. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.